The locomotive slowed before Alara Voss was ready for it to stop. She had been watching the land change for 3 days, the soft green hills of Ohio flattening into the wide brown sweep of the plains, the sky growing larger the further west they traveled, as though the earth were shrinking to make room for it. She had never seen sky like this. In Boston, sky was what existed between buildings. Here it was the main event, vast and indifferent, and it made her feel very small in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. The advertisement lay folded in her coat pocket. She did not need to read it again. She had read it enough times that she could have recited it in her sleep. Had she slept much these past 3 days? Wanted a capable woman for the position of schoolteacher, Iron Bell Ranch, Larimer County, Wyoming Territory. Arrangement includes room board and a modest wage. The woman must be willing to work. References required. Correspondence to Mr. C. Reed. What it did not say, but what Alara had understood perfectly when the agency in Boston had handed it to her, alongside a separate letter from a Mr. Abernathy at the agency's Western office, was that capable woman meant wife. The agency handled the formalities. The agency wrote the language that made the transaction seem civilized. Alara had signed her name to the corresponding paperwork with the deliberate steadiness of a woman signing a business contract, which was precisely what she believed it to be. She was not a romantic. She had been a romantic once in the way that young women are sometimes romantic, before life has the opportunity to correct them. That had been before the Whitmore School. Before the parents' meeting she had not been invited to attend. Before the letter from the school board that had arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, addressed in the tight formal script of people who had already decided the matter before writing it down. She pressed her palm flat against the folded advertisement in her pocket. The train lurched. The brakes caught. Outside the window, a water tower and a scattering of low buildings appeared, and above the largest one a painted sign that she had to lean close to the glass to read. Cold water. Population 312. 312 souls, she thought. She had taught a class of 31 in Boston, and that had felt like a manageable number of people to disappoint. He was already there when she stepped down from the platform. She recognized him not because she had been given a description the agency had offered none, but because he was the only person on the platform who was not in motion. Everyone else was moving a boy hauling a mail sack, two women in conversation, gesturing with their hands. A station master consulting his watch. The man standing at the far end of the platform stood completely still, his hat pushed back on his head, his arms loose at his sides, watching the train with the patience of someone who had spent a great deal of his life waiting on things that arrived on schedules other than his own. He was taller than she had expected, broader. His coat was good quality, but old worn at the elbows in a way that suggested he used it rather than kept it. His face was tan past the point that came from a single summer, the kind of tan that was written into the skin permanently, and there were lines around his eyes that might have been from squinting into the sun or from some older kind of weather entirely. He saw her see him. He crossed the platform without hurrying. Miss Voss. Not a question. Mr. Reed. She extended her hand. He shook it once briefly with the grip of a man who was being careful not to use his full strength. The wagon's down the street. I can take your bag. I have it, thank you. He looked at the single carpet bag in her hand. Then he looked at her. Some calculation happened behind his eyes, though she could not read what he was calculating. All right, he said. That was the entirety of their introduction. The ride to Iron Bell took 40 minutes. The road was packed dirt, mostly flat, cutting through grassland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. In October, the grass had gone gold, and the sky above it was the deep, aching blue of a color that has no name in most languages. Elara sat on the wagon bench with her hands in her lap and watched the land, and said nothing because she had not yet determined what kind of silence this was. Callum Reed did not appear to need conversation. He drove with the reins held loose in one hand, his attention moving steadily across the landscape in the unhurried way of a man reading something familiar. Once he pointed without comment at a hawk riding a thermal to the north. Once he said, "Road gets rougher past the fence line. Might want to hold on." She held on. The road got rougher. He had been correct. The fence line came into view eventually, not a fence exactly, but a series of posts marking the edge of something larger. And beyond it, the land changed in a way that was difficult to articulate. The grass was still grass. The sky still sky. But there was something in the way the cattle moved in the middle distance, in the geometry of the outbuildings visible on the horizon, that communicated tended. That communicated claimed. "How large is the property?" she asked. "Little over 4,000 acres. She had no frame of reference for 4,000 acres. She had grown up in a city where space was measured in rooms and the distance between streetcar stops. "That's very large," she said, which was inadequate, but he did not seem to expect anything more precise. The main house came into view as they crested a low rise. It was not what she had imagined, though she realized she had made the mistake of imagining. She had pictured something rough, something provisional, the kind of structure that spoke of a man who had built it quickly and intended to build something better eventually. Instead, the house was solid and well-proportioned. 2 stories of pale timber, with a long covered porch running the full width of the front 2 chimneys windows that caught the afternoon light and held it. Beside it stood a barn, a bunkhouse, a smithy, and several smaller structures. Beyond all of this, a corral where 3 horses moved in slow circles, and pasture land stretching away into the distance, broken here and there by the dark shapes of cattle. "You built all of this," she said. It was not quite a question. "Over 15 years. He said it the way people say things that are simply true and require no elaboration. He pulled the wagon up to a smaller structure set back from the main house, a cabin neat and plainly constructed with curtains in the single front window, and a narrow porch with 2 wooden chairs. "This is yours," he said, setting the brake. "I had it made ready." Elara climbed down from the wagon without waiting for assistance. She stood in front of the cabin and looked at it. It was clean. It was weather-tight. It was, she thought, a reasonable place to begin whatever this was. "Thank you," she said. Inside was where the careful neutrality of Callum Reed's preparations became visible at its edges. The main room held a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a shelf with 4 books on it. Clean, adequate. The bedroom was made up with a quilt that someone had taken care with, the kind of quilt that represented many hours of work, and on the dresser a small pitcher and basin. Everything was clean. Everything was also slightly wrong. The curtains in the bedroom window were too short. Not wrong in a way that mattered practically, but wrong in a way that revealed someone had measured without quite measuring. The quilt was beautiful, but clearly old, with a pattern that suggested it had belonged to someone before it belonged to this bed. The 4 books on the shelf were arranged spine out, which was normal, but when Elara looked closer, she saw that one of them, a volume of Tennyson, had a small piece of ribbon marking a page, dried at the edges as though someone had placed it there and not returned to remove it. She did not touch the ribbon. She set her carpet bag on the floor and stood in the center of the room and understood in the particular way that women understand things that no one has said out loud, that this space had been created in a hurry. Not because Callum Reed was a careless man, but because until very recently, it had held someone else's things. A knock at the door. She opened it. The woman on the other side was perhaps 60, built with the solidity of someone who had worked her entire life and expected to work for the rest of it. Her hair was iron gray and pinned with the efficiency of someone who considered hair an administrative matter. Her eyes were blue and sharp and moved over Elara in a single, unhurried sweep that took in everything. "Mrs. Stills," the woman said. "Nora Stills. I manage the house." She paused. "Mr. Reed's house. Elara Voss. I know who you are." Not unkindly, simply factually. "Supper's at 6. The hands eat in the bunkhouse. You'll eat with Mr. Reed at the main house or here if you prefer. He said it was your choice. I'll eat here this evening if that's no inconvenience." Nora Stills looked at her for a moment as though recalibrating some internal measurement. "I'll bring a plate." She turned to go, then turned back. "The well is 20 yards north. Don't let the rope play out more than halfway or the bucket catches on the stones. Mr. Reed keeps meaning to fix it." "Thank you." "You'll want to know," Nora said, and then stopped and something moved across her face. Not regret exactly, but its shadow. "You'll want to know how things work here. There are ways things work. You'll pick them up." She left before Elara could ask her to be more specific. Callum came by an hour later. Elara had used the hour to unpack her bag, arrange the 4 items she owned that could be called decorative, and conduct a quiet inspection of the cabin that told her several things she filed away without yet analyzing. She had just put the kettle on when she heard his boots on the porch steps. She opened the door. "I wanted to show you the bedroom window," he said without preamble. "The latch sticks. You have to lift the frame slightly before you turn it, otherwise it won't catch." He demonstrated lifting the bottom sash of the front window as he passed. "Same principle on the bedroom one. If you try to force it, the whole mechanism comes loose, drops right out. I've been meaning to reset it since July." She stood and watched him demonstrate the window latch with the focused attention of a man explaining something genuinely important. "July," she said. "August, maybe." He considered this. One of those months. "Thank you for the warning." He looked at the window for a moment longer as though determining whether there was more to say about it. Apparently there was not. He turned to face her, and for the first time, he seemed slightly uncertain of what he was doing in this room. "The schoolhouse is the building east of the barn," he said. "I can show you tomorrow if you want to see it before the children come." "How many children?" "7 from the neighboring ranches. Yours makes 8. He paused. If you brought children, the paperwork. I have no children. Something tightened at the back of her throat and then released. It's just me. All right, he said. The same 2 words as before, carrying the same quality. Not indifference, but a kind of acceptance so practiced it was difficult to distinguish from indifference. He moved toward the door, stopped. Said without turning around, Miss Voss, if there's anything the cabin lacks, tell Mrs. Stills. She'll see to it. Mr. Reed. He turned. She met his eyes. Brown, she noticed. Dark brown and direct and carrying something she could not yet name. Why is this furniture only half emptied? A silence. The room was used for storage, he said. Most of it's been moved. Most of it, she said. Another silence. Longer. I'll have the rest cleared tomorrow, he said. Then he left. She stood in the middle of the half-emptied room and listened to his boots descend the porch steps and cross the yard. And she thought, he is a man who is telling me the truth and omitting the most important part of it. She had known several such men in her life. She had not expected to meet one here. The journal was in the bottom drawer of the dresser. She found it the following week while looking for an extra blanket. The drawer she had checked before and found empty had been disturbed since its contents shifted, as though someone had been in the room while she was teaching. She would not have looked at the journal except that it was not in an envelope and not face down, which struck her as either carelessness or an invitation. It was small bound in dark blue cloth, its corners worn soft with handling. She sat on the edge of the bed with it in her hands for a long moment. Then she opened it. The handwriting inside was not Callum Reed's. It was a woman's hand, careful and slightly formal. The hand of someone who had been taught penmanship and took it seriously. The entries were irregular, sometimes daily, sometimes separated by weeks. Ilara did not read the whole of it. She read enough. February 14th. He left this morning for the southern pasture. He'll be gone 4 days. I watched the wagon until I couldn't see it anymore, which is foolish. I don't know why I do that. March 3rd. Good day. Made bread. He said it was fine. I think he meant it. April 19th. Mrs. Kettridge asked me today if I was happy here. I said of course. Then I came home and sat in the kitchen for an hour without doing anything. I don't know what I would have said if she'd asked again. July 7th. He works from before light until after dark, and he is kind when he remembers to be, which is most of the time. I just wonder sometimes. I wonder if he knows I'm here. I don't mean physically. The last entry was dated October the following year, a year and a half after the first. October 22nd. Feeling tired. Callum keeps saying I should rest, but there is always something that needs doing. I told him I was fine. He believed me because he needed to, I think. Or maybe I needed him to. And then nothing more. Ilara closed the journal. She sat with it in her hands and thought about a woman who had sat in this room and looked out this window and written in this careful, formal hand about a man who forgot to look at her directly. She thought about Nora Stills saying he won't stay on his own, with the conviction of someone who had watched a slow process for years. She thought about Callum Reed saying most of it's been moved with the particular quality of a man telling the truth about the wrong thing. She set the journal on the dresser. She said quietly to no one, "Well, at least she and I have that in common." She did not mean it as a joke, but it landed somewhere between grief and dark recognition, in the particular territory where those two things coexist without resolving into either. But before she had found the document that explained the journal, there had been the document that explained everything else. She had found it 2 mornings earlier in the bottom drawer of the dresser, when the blanket was still the thing she was looking for, and the drawer had been empty of everything except the blanket folded at the very back. What had not been in the drawer yet was the journal. What had been there was a single sheet of paper, unenveloped face up, that she would not have looked at, except that it was not face down. It was a copy of the advertisement, handwritten, not typeset, which told her it was the original draft rather than the printed version the agency had shown her. The handwriting was Callum Reed's, she could tell from the same quality of compressed practicality that characterized everything she had seen of him. And it read in its entirety, "Wanted schoolteacher. Room and board provided. Good standing expected. Small wage. Contact. C. Reed Iron Bell, Wyoming. No mention of a wife. No mention of a woman. No mention of any arrangement that could be construed as matrimonial." Elara sat on the edge of the bed with the paper in her hands and read it twice. Then she went to find Nora Stills. She found her in the main house kitchen, moving with the calm efficiency of someone who had organized this kitchen long enough that she no longer needed to think about where anything was. "Mrs. Stills," Elara said, and set the paper on the table. "I'd like to understand something." Nora looked at the paper. She did not look surprised. She did not look guilty. She looked, if anything, like a woman who had been expecting this conversation and had decided some time ago how she intended to conduct it. "Sit down, Miss Voss." "I'd rather stand." Nora made a small sound that was not quite a sigh. She set down the spoon she was holding. "Mr. Reed wanted a teacher," she said. "That part is true. Those children haven't had schooling in 4 months. The last teacher left to get married." A pause. "The irony isn't lost on me. He didn't place the advertisement with the agency as written. No. Someone did. Yes." Elara let the silence hold. She had learned in 26 years of dealing with people who had done something they would prefer not to explain that silence was more useful than pressure. Nora Stills picked up her spoon again, set it down again. "He won't stay on his own," she said quietly. "He's been on his own for 7 years, and he doesn't know what it's doing to him because he never looks at himself directly. He looks at the land. He looks at the cattle. He looks at everything that needs doing, and he does it." She stopped. "He needed a teacher. I thought he needed more than that, so I contacted the agency and used his name. He doesn't know. I expect now you'll tell him." "That's not yet determined," Elara said. She picked up the paper and walked back to the cabin. She sat at the table and looked out the window at the barn and the bunkhouse and the big pale timber house, and she thought about a man who wanted a teacher. and a woman who had forged his intentions, and she thought about herself, who had needed to leave Boston badly enough to sign her name to a document without asking enough questions. She thought, we have all deceived each other to end up here. She could not decide if that made it better or worse. The schoolhouse was a converted storage building east of the barn, and it smelled of sawdust and old grain, and someone had installed a blackboard along the north wall with more enthusiasm than precision. It hung at a slight angle that Elara noticed immediately, but said nothing about. There were 8 desks. She spent the first morning arranging and rearranging them until she found a configuration she could work with. She found chalk in a tin on the shelf beside the blackboard. She found a primer outdated by 10 years but serviceable. She found a copybook that had been used by a previous child whose name had been scratched out on the cover, the scratching out done with such determination that the cardboard had torn. She was measuring the height of the blackboard. It was installed too high for the younger children, and she was deciding whether this could be remedied with a step stool or whether it required adjustment when she became aware that she was being watched. The man in the doorway was not Callum Reed. He was roughly the same age, perhaps a few years older, with the same quality of permanent outdoor weathering. But where Callum Reed's face settled into stillness, this man's face arranged itself into an expression of friendly openness that Elara recognized from long experience as a performance. Not dishonest necessarily, simply managed. "Deke Harmon," he said with a smile that reached his eyes and stopped. "I run the Harmon spread south of the creek. I've got 2 boys in your school." He looked around the building with the deliberate approval of someone who has decided in advance to be approving. "Looks like you're getting it set up nicely." "Thank you." "Quite a journey coming out from," he waited. "Boston," she said, though she had not intended to. "Boston." He said it the way people say the name of a foreign capital, acknowledging its existence without particular warmth. "That's quite a change." "Yes." He looked at the blackboard. He looked at the desks she had arranged. He looked at her with the particular quality of attention that was less about seeing her than about placing her, deciding where she fit in a map he had already drawn. "Well," he said, "good to have a teacher again. Those kids have been running loose." Another smile, the same quality. "If there's anything you need, anything Callum hasn't thought to provide you, come find me. My wife and I are happy to help." "That's very kind," she said. He tipped his hat and left. She watched him cross the yard, watched him stop to exchange words with one of the hands, watched him glance back once toward the schoolhouse before continuing on. She turned back to the blackboard and its slight angle. She thought, that man is going to cause me a problem. She did not yet know what kind, only that she had seen his particular species of attention before, and that it never amounted to nothing. 3 weeks passed. The children arrived on a Monday, 7 of them, ranging from 6 to 13 from 4 neighboring ranches. They came with varying degrees of preparation and varying degrees of enthusiasm. The youngest with the trusting open attention of those who have not yet learned that not all adults deserve it. The oldest with the watchful reserve of those who have. Elara taught the way she had always taught, which was to say directly and without condescension, on the understanding that children are capable of much more than adults generally credit them with. She taught reading and arithmetic, and on Fridays history, which she had always believed was the subject most likely to explain the world. She kept the blackboard visible to all 8 desks by bringing the front rows forward and placing a step stool for the youngest 2, which solved the height problem without requiring anyone to adjust a wall. Callum came by the schoolhouse once in the first week, stood in the doorway for a few minutes watching, and left without comment. The second week he came twice, both times briefly. He never interrupted. He never explained what he was doing there. She did not ask. In the evenings, she ate alone in the cabin or occasionally at the main house when Nora extended an invitation that was framed as a suggestion and functioned as a mild imperative. At the main house, Callum ate at the head of the table with the economy of movement of a man for whom dinner is fuel rather than occasion. They talked about practical things. The schoolhouse roof needed inspection. Before winter, 2 of the children were behind in reading and might need extra sessions. The well rope should be replaced before the temperature dropped. Once over coffee, he said, "You're good with them." She waited to see if he would say more. He did not. "They're good students," she said. He turned his cup on the table once a quarter rotation. "The Braddock boy, older one. He's not learning to read because he can't. He's not learning because someone told him he couldn't." "I know," she said. "I've been working around it." He looked at her, then directly, in the way he sometimes did when something surprised him, as though surprise was a thing he had learned to keep mostly internal, but which occasionally surfaced. "All right," he said. The same 2 words, but this time they meant something different. On the first Monday of November, 2 children did not come to school. They were the Harmon boys, Deke. Harmon's 2 sons, the older one 11, the younger 8. No explanation came with their absence. Elara taught the remaining 6 children and said nothing and turned the matter over in her mind all afternoon. The next day, a woman she did not know stopped her outside the general store in Coldwater. Not Harmon's wife. Someone else. Someone whose children attended a different school in the next town over, which meant her presence in this conversation was not accidental. "I heard," the woman said in the tone of someone delivering information they expect to be received with gratitude, "that there was some trouble in Boston with one of the children at your school." Elara said, "I beg your pardon." The woman looked at her with the expression of someone who has just said something they cannot unsay and is trying to determine whether to commit to it or retreat. She committed. "I just thought with the children here you'd understand why people might want to know a little more about who's teaching them." Elara looked at her for a long moment. She thought about all the things she could say. She had prepared for this in the abstract. During the 3 days on the train, she had known it was possible, had told herself she was ready, had rehearsed versions of the explanation that was not quite a defense, but would have to function as one. She said nothing. She turned and walked back down the street, and she did not let her pace quicken, even though every instinct told her to move faster, because she had learned in Boston that the pace of your departure was itself a form of testimony. She did not tell Callum. She made that decision deliberately, with the same deliberateness with which she had unpacked her bag in a room that was half emptied of someone else's life. She had managed things on her own before. She was managing things on her own now. To tell him would be to require something from him before she had determined whether it was safe to do so. This was the first mistake she made at Iron Bell. She would not recognize it as a mistake for some time. By then, it would have grown. That evening, for the first time, Nora Stills told her something she had not been asked. They were in the main house kitchen after supper, Nora washing and Elara drying an arrangement that had developed in the past weeks, with no discussion and no acknowledgement. Nora said without turning from the wash basin, "You'll want to know how things work here." It was the same sentence she had said on the first day, but its weight was different now. "I'm listening," Elara said. "People talk in a town this size," Nora said. "They talk because there's not enough else to do, and because talking makes them feel they have some say in things they don't actually have a say in." She was scrubbing a pot with focused attention. They talked about Mr. Reed when his wife died. They talked about how he handled it, which was badly in their opinion because he didn't handle it publicly enough. Men who go quiet after a loss make people uncomfortable. She set the pot in the rinse basin. "You will want to be careful of people talking, of people deciding things about you before you've had a chance to be anything to them." Nora turned and handed her the pot. Their eyes met. "I'm not saying this to frighten you, Miss Voss. I'm saying this because you're here. And the winter is coming, and it will be easier to weather if you understand the terrain." Elara dried the pot. "And what is the terrain?" Nora turned back to the wash basin. After a moment, she said, "Mr. Reed is a good man. He is a fair man. He is a man who forgets to look at people directly, which can be mistaken for not caring but isn't." Another pause. "He's also a man who will not ask for help. Not because he's proud exactly, because he's forgotten he's allowed to." Elara set the pot on its shelf. She looked at the back of Nora Stills's head, at the iron-gray hair pinned with administrative precision. "You adjusted the advertisement," she said, "to bring me here." Nora did not answer. "I'm not going to tell him," Elara said. The hands in the wash basin went still. "At least not yet," Elara said. "I haven't decided what it means for either of us yet, but I thought you should know. I know." She hung the dish towel on its hook and walked back to the cabin, in the cold dark past the barn, where one of the horses moved in its stall, with a sound like a long exhalation. Past the corral fence, gleaming silver in the early moonlight. The sky above her was enormous and salted with stars. She stopped on the porch and stood in the cold, and thought about a man who went quiet after his wife died, and had been quiet for 7 years. She thought about a woman who had written, "I wonder if he knows I'm here," and then died wondering. She thought about herself standing in the dark in Wyoming in the first week of November, with no one waiting for her inside the cabin, which was the same as Boston, except that here the sky was much, much larger. She was not happy. She was not unhappy. She was, for the first time in 14 months, in a situation complicated enough to require her full attention. That was not nothing. She went inside, lit the lamp, and opened the Tennyson from the shelf. She did not read it. She looked at the dried ribbon marking a page and thought, "Whoever you were, I'm sorry I didn't know you." Then she set the book on the table and began to plan the next week's lessons. Outside, the wind off the plains moved through the long grass with a sound like patience, like something that had been waiting a long time and had decided it could wait a little longer. The third child left on a Wednesday. Elara was mid-sentence at the blackboard, the letter Q, which most of the younger children found genuinely offensive, when she looked up and counted 6 instead of 7. The Kettridge girl, 9 years old, with the attentive brown eyes of someone who had been listening carefully since the first day. Her desk was empty. Her copybook was not on it, which meant she had not forgotten to come. She had been told not to. Elara finished the lesson. She gave the 6 remaining children a copying exercise, walked to the window and stood there for a moment, looking at the corral. She thought about the woman outside the general store. She thought about Deke Harmon in the schoolhouse doorway with his managed smile and his particular quality of attention. She thought about the letter she had received from a school board in Boston 14 months ago, formal script on heavy paper, and how she had read it standing at the kitchen table with her coat still on, because she had just come in from outside and had not yet decided to stay. She turned back to her students. Martin Braddock, the older one, the one who had been told he couldn't learn, was bending over his copybook with the fierce concentration of someone proving something. She watched him for a moment. "Good," she said quietly, though she had not walked close enough to see his work. She had learned that sometimes what children needed was not correction, but the simple information that someone was paying attention. She did not go to Callum that evening. She ate alone and read and went to bed early and lay in the dark and listened to the Wyoming wind and thought about how many ways there were to lose ground quietly without anyone being able to point to the precise moment it began. 4 days later, Deke Harmon came to the schoolhouse again. This time he came without his boys. This time he came in the late afternoon when the children had gone home and Elara was erasing the blackboard with the methodical attention she brought to everything that needed doing, which was the only way she knew to do things. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Harmon." He came into the room and stood where he had stood before with the same managed openness and the same quality of a man who has decided in advance what he intends to accomplish. He looked around the room. He looked at the blackboard, at the desks, at her. "My boys are going to be staying home for a while," he said. "I wanted to tell you myself." "That's considerate," she said. She continued erasing. "I don't want you to think it's anything personal. It's just, in a community like this, people have concerns about their children's education." He paused. "About who's providing it?" She set the eraser down. She turned and faced him. She had a great deal of practice at facing people who were telling her something they had rehearsed. "And where did the community's concerns originate?" she asked. He made a small sound of discomfort that he smoothed over immediately. "These things get around. I'm sure you understand. Small town." "Where did they originate, Mr. Harmon?" The managed openness held for another moment. Then something shifted in it, not dropping entirely, but adjusting. "There was a letter," he said, "passed through the post office to the Harrington woman over on Miller Creek. Apparently it was partly legible. Some mention of a school in Boston. Some mention of a student. A letter to Ida Harrington on Miller Creek." Elara ran back through her first weeks here, sorted through what she had written and to whom. She had written to her landlady in Boston about her forwarding address. She had written to 2 former colleagues. She had written to her brother Fletcher because Fletcher worried and because silence to Fletcher was never taken as reassurance. but always as evidence of something worse. The letter to Fletcher. She had mentioned Coldwater by name. She had mentioned Iron Bell. She had mentioned the school. And somewhere between Boston and Miller Creek, through the handling of the Coldwater post office, through whatever chain of small-town distribution, caused letters to travel laterally. As well as to their destinations, a partly legible page had found its way to the wrong hands, or the right hands, depending on your intentions. "I see," she said. She picked up the eraser again. "Thank you for telling me yourself." He stood for a moment longer, clearly expecting something further. An explanation, a defense, possibly tears. He got none of these. After a moment he left, and she listened to his boots on the packed dirt of the yard until she could no longer hear them. Then she sat at the front desk, the one she used for her own work, and put both hands flat on the surface of it. The wood was cold. She pressed her palms against it and felt the cold and thought with precision about what she was going to do. The precision was important. In the absence of good options, precision was the thing that kept panic from settling in. She went to Callum that night, not to tell him. She had not changed her position on that. She went because she needed to think out loud, and there was no one else in this territory who knew her well enough to be useful, which was a low bar, but it was the bar she had. He was on the porch of the main house with a cup of coffee, looking out at the dark in the direction of the eastern pasture. He did not appear surprised to see her, though she had never come to the main house in the evening uninvited. He made room on the step without saying anything. She sat. He poured from a second cup that was already there, which she noted without commenting on. 3 children gone, she said. I know. Of course he knew. He knew everything that happened on this land, and within a reasonable radius of it. He simply did not announce that he knew things until they became relevant to a conversation. More will follow, she said. Probably. He was quiet for a moment. Probably. The wind was coming from the north. It had a new quality to it. Harder than the wind she had been learning, with something in it that felt like a shift. Not just in temperature, but in intention. The way weather sometimes feels less like weather and more like a decision being made. Is there anything to be done about it? She asked. He turned his cup in his hands once. Depends, he said, on what's causing it. She looked out at the dark. There was a letter, she said, in transit, partially read by someone who then decided to be helpful to the community. She paused. There was something in it about a school in Boston, about a student, a silence. And, he said, and that's what I'm telling you, she said, that the letter exists and that someone used it. He did not ask her what the letter contained. She noticed that. He was asking a different question with his silence, or perhaps not asking anything at all, simply offering the space in which the information could exist without needing to go further. She did not offer more. They sat and drank coffee in the cold and listened to the wind gather itself. After a while, Callum said, Deke Harmon came to talk to me last week. She looked at him. He was still looking at the dark. Before the Kettridge girl stopped coming. Before today. He turned his cup. He was interested in the eastern pasture. Said he'd pay well for it, which is true, he probably would. A pause. He said something else, too. Said it might simplify things. Having the property consolidated. Reduce complications. She understood the architecture of this conversation without needing to be told. He meant me. He didn't say so directly. No, she said. He wouldn't. Callum put the cup down. He turned to look at her directly the way he sometimes did when something required his full attention. I told him the eastern pasture isn't for sale, he said. I told him my property arrangements aren't his concern. A pause, just long enough. I told him decisions made on my land are mine to make. Elara looked back at him. She thought about the kind of man who says that without being asked to, without knowing yet what the decision is, without any guarantee that the decision will be worth making. That was fair of you, she said. Her voice was level. She was working to keep it level. It was accurate, he said, which was a different thing, and they both knew it. She went back to the cabin an hour later. She stood on her own porch in the cold and pressed one hand against the window frame and thought. He lost something by saying that. Not the land which he can keep, but the ease of the easier path, she thought. He did it without asking what's in the letter. She thought, that is either the action of a very good man or a very reckless one, and I have not been here long enough to know which. She went inside and did not sleep well, and was at the schoolhouse early the next morning with 5 students waiting. Fletcher came on a Tuesday in the second week of November, and Elara knew before she saw his face that he was there because she had seen his horse. It was a gray gelding, too well bred for Wyoming, tied to the post outside the general store, and she recognized it not from the horse itself, but from the way it stood with the particular long-suffering patience of an animal that belonged to someone who made impractical decisions and then expected the horse to accommodate them. She had grown up watching that horse stand in exactly that posture outside every establishment in Boston that Fletcher had ever decided to visit at an inconvenient time. She stopped walking. She looked at the horse for a moment. Then she went into the general store. Fletcher was at the counter buying tobacco he didn't smoke, which was his way of having a reason to be somewhere when he didn't want to explain the actual reason. He was 41, lean in the way of a man who moved through the world quickly, with the same gray eyes as Elara, and the same quality of paying attention that read on him as intensity and on her as composure. He turned when she came in. "Ellie," he said. "Don't," she said. He paid for the tobacco. They went outside. She did not ask how he had found her. She had written to him when she first arrived not to invite him, only to give him her address, because Fletcher, without an address, became a man who assumed the worst, and Fletcher, once given a name and a territory, could find a thing in the dark. She asked instead, because it was the correct question, "What's happened?" He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who has rehearsed several versions of a conversation and is now deciding which one to begin. "Reverend Coates is retired," he said. "The new man, Abernathy Young, very earnest, has been asking questions about the Whitmore situation." A pause. "He's been talking to the parents, not accusing, asking. And when he asks Miss Voss, the answers he gets are different from what the board put in that letter last October." Elara stood very still. "He wants you to come back," Fletcher said. Not to teach. Not yet, maybe not ever. That's for the community to decide. But to testify. To tell your version in front of the people who were told a different one. He stopped. If you come back and do that, there's a real possibility that the record gets corrected. Officially. The wind came down the main street of Coldwater and moved the sign above the hardware store and kept going. And if I don't, she said, then the record stays as it is. He said it without accusation, which was the kindest way he could have said it. I'm not telling you what to do, Ellie. I'm telling you what the situation is. She looked down the street at the brown and gold land beyond the town's edge, at the sky that was already beginning to take on the lowering quality that preceded weather. I'll need time to think, she said. Of course. Fletcher glanced up the street in the direction of Iron Bell. Is it terrible here? She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. No, she said finally. It's complicated. He looked at her face. That's almost worse, he said. He came to the ranch for dinner because there was no hotel in Coldwater. Only a rooming house that was full of miners. And because Callum Reed, when told of the situation by Alara, with the minimum of explanation, said without hesitation, he can stay the night. The four of them ate at the main house table, Callum, Nora, Alara, Fletcher, in the polite and slightly charged atmosphere of people who are eating together, because the circumstances require it, rather than because anyone has elected to. Fletcher was, to his credit, genuinely trying. He asked Callum about the ranch with the curiosity of someone who is actually curious. Which was true of Fletcher. He was genuinely interested in most things, which made him charming in a way that was almost exhausting. Callum answered in his characteristic fashion, briefly and factually, but without hostility. 15 years, Fletcher said when Callum had described how the ranch had begun. To go from 10 acres to 4,000, more or less. That's remarkable. It's work, Callum said, not dismissively, simply accurately. Nora, who had been eating with the concentration of a woman listening to everything without appearing to listen to anything, said, Mr. Reed is being modest. When he started, most people in the county gave him 3 years before he sold. Mrs. Stills, Callum said mildly. It's true, she said, with the serenity of someone who has earned the right to say true things. After dinner, the storm arrived. It had been building all day. Alara had watched it from the schoolhouse window, the sky thickening to the north, the temperature dropping in increments so gradual you could almost convince yourself it wasn't happening until you stepped outside and couldn't anymore. By the time they finished eating, it had become definitive. Sleet first ticking against the windows, then snow, then the particular sound of wind at serious velocity. You won't make it to town, Callum said, looking at the window. He said it to Fletcher without any suggestion of inconvenience. The road will be impassable in an hour. Fletcher looked at the window. Right, he said. Well. They moved to the main room. Nora built up the fire. Callum brought a bottle of whiskey from the cabinet, with the practiced indifference of a man who has hosted enough people to know that the right object offered at the right moment covers a great deal of social awkwardness, and poured 4 glasses without asking. Alara sat in the chair nearest the fire. Fletcher sat across from her. Callum sat at the end of the room near the window, turned slightly to look out at the storm. Nora sat nearest the door, which was where Nora always sat, as though she expected to be needed somewhere else, and was positioning herself accordingly. The fire was loud. The wind was louder. "I've never been west of Chicago before," Fletcher said to no one in particular. He was looking at the ceiling where the wind was testing the rafters. "It's very present out here. The weather. It makes itself known," Callum said. "In Boston," Fletcher continued, "we have weather, but it feels like a matter of inconvenience, an interruption. Out here, it feels like it has opinions." "It does," Nora said, which made Fletcher look at her with the surprised pleasure of someone not expecting to be agreed with. Callum turned from the window. He said without particular preamble, "I started with 10 acres and a loan I wasn't sure I could repay. First winter, I lost 4 cattle to the cold and 1 to something I never identified." He looked at the fire. "Neighbor to the south came by in the spring and offered to buy me out. Said it kindly. Said it in the voice of a man who's already made up his mind that the thing he's watching is gonna fail, and has gotten to the point of being compassionate about it." Fletcher said, "What did you do?" "Kept working," Callum said. "There wasn't anything else to do." He turned his glass on the table once. "The neighbor sold his place 6 years later. His son runs a hardware store in Denver." Fletcher looked at him with the expression he got when he'd heard something he intended to remember. Then he looked at Alara. She was watching Callum. She was aware that Fletcher was watching her watch Callum, and she was aware of what conclusions Fletcher was capable of drawing from such observations. And she found to her mild surprise that she did not especially care. "Mr. Reed," Fletcher said in the tone of a man about to ask the question. He came to ask, "What is your feeling about my sister's situation here?" "Fletcher," Ilara said. "It's a fair question," Fletcher said pleasantly. "You're a man of obvious perspicacity. You've had her here for what, 7 weeks? 8, Callum said. 8 weeks. You've seen how she works. You've seen," he gestured in a way that somehow encompassed the whole situation, "all of this. I'm asking what your assessment is." Callum looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Alara. She met his eyes and held them. And she thought, whatever he says next, it's true. He doesn't say things that aren't. "She's a good teacher," Callum said. "She's fair-minded. She doesn't complain about what's hard." He looked back at Fletcher. "She's dealt with things here that would have sent a different woman back to the train station." A pause. "I think she should stay." Fletcher looked at his glass. Then he looked at Alara again, and she knew from his face that the observation was going into the permanent record where Fletcher stored all things he considered significant. "Well," Fletcher said, "that's clear enough." Nora stood and announced she was going to heat water for tea, and the moment reorganized itself around that practical intention, which was precisely why Nora had done it. Later, when Fletcher had been shown to the spare room and Nora had retired, Alara put on her coat to walk back to the cabin. Callum walked with her to the porch, which he had taken to doing in the past few weeks, without either of them naming it as a habit. The storm was still moving. The yard was white, the snow coming sideways in the lamplight from the barn. "What he said," Callum said, "about Boston. The reason you left." She waited. "I'm not going to ask," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the snow, his profile lit from below by the light coming through the window. "Not because it doesn't matter," he said. but because you'll tell me when it's time, or you won't, and either way it doesn't change." He stopped. He was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't change what I said to your brother." She stood in the cold and felt something shift somewhere in the complicated machinery of how she had organized herself. Not collapse, nothing collapsed, but shift. "It should matter to you," she said. "You don't know what it is." "No," he said, "but I know what you are." He turned to look at her. The same direct look, the same quality of having thought carefully before speaking. "And I've been wrong about those two things being connected before." She understood what he was telling her, and what he was not quite telling her, and what it had cost him to distinguish between those two things. "Good night, Mr. Reed," she said. "Good night, Miss Voss." She walked back to the cabin in the snow, and she thought about the journal and the entry that said, "I wonder if he knows I'm here." And she thought, he knows. He just learned to look the hard way, and she did not know if that made things better or worse, but it made them true. And truth was the only currency she had ever been willing to trade in. In the morning, Fletcher ate breakfast and then said he needed to get back to Coldwater before the road became more complicated than it already was. Elara walked with him to his horse, which was standing in the barn with the same long-suffering patience now, augmented by an expression of profound personal grievance about the snow. "I need to know," Fletcher said, tightening the cinch with the focused attention of someone avoiding eye contact. "I know you do. Ellie." He stopped, looked at her. "Whatever you decide. I'm not going to tell you it's wrong. I'm going to tell you that the chance in Boston is real, and it won't stay open indefinitely." He paused. "And I'm going to tell you that the man in that house has looked at you every time you weren't looking at him the entire evening. Which is information. Do with it what you want." She looked at the barn wall for a moment. "The chance in Boston requires me to go back and explain myself to people who have already decided. It requires you to tell the truth in front of people who were told a lie. It requires me to need them to believe me. Again." She turned. "I had to need that once. It went a particular way. I'd prefer not to require it of myself again." Fletcher was quiet. He led the horse out of the barn and mounted, and he sat above her for a moment in the thin November light, looking down at her with the expression of a man who knows his sister and knows the limits of argument. "I'll write when I'm back in Boston," he said. "Take the time you need. But, Ellie—" He stopped the horse, looked at her directly. "Don't stay somewhere just because leaving feels harder than it used to." He rode out. She watched him go down the drive until the curve of the land took him, and she stood in the cold, long after the sound of the horse was gone. She told Callum that evening that she would be returning to Boston. She told him in the main house after supper, when the table was cleared, and Nora had gone to bed, and the only light in the room was the lamp on the sideboard and the last of the fire. She told him in the deliberate voice she used when she had rehearsed something and intended to deliver it cleanly. She gave him the reasons, the official ones which were true. Her brother had come with a real opportunity, the kind that closed if you didn't move toward it. She gave him the practical ones, also true. The school was losing students. The community's doubts had a real source. The situation was not improving on its own. She did not give him the reason that was truest, which was that she was afraid of staying, not of Wyoming, not of the school or the land or the cold, of staying specifically of what staying meant, and what she would have to ask of herself if she did. Callum listened. He sat across the table from her with both hands flat on the surface, which was not his usual posture, and she noticed it but could not read it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "When?" he said. The question hit somewhere she hadn't braced. "I haven't determined that yet." He nodded. "Once." He looked at the table. Then he looked at her directly with the quality she had come to recognize as his particular form of honesty. Not comfortable, not managed, just true. "I'm not going to tell you not to," he said. "That's not my place." He paused. "But I want you to know what I said to your brother. That's not a thing I said for his benefit." She held his eyes. She felt the weight of it, the particular gravity of a simple sentence spoken by someone who does not speak easily. "I know," she said. "All right," he said. She went back to the cabin. She stood inside the door for a long moment without lighting the lamp, standing in the dark that smelled of wood smoke and pine and the dried wildflowers she had put in a jar on the shelf 2 weeks ago because the cabin needed something living in it. She had told him she was going. She had not told him she was certain. Those were not the same thing, and she stood in the dark with that distinction and let it breathe. The lamp was still unlit when she woke up. She had fallen asleep in the chair, still in her coat, her head tipped to one side in the way of a person who had not intended to sleep at all. The fire in the wood stove had burned to embers. The cabin was cold. Outside the window, the storm had passed and the world was white and very still. The particular stillness that follows whether the silence of a landscape that has been rearranged and has not yet resumed its habits. She sat there for a while without moving. Then she stood, rebuilt the fire, put the kettle on, and changed her clothes. She did not think about what she was doing. She did not examine it. She had learned in the 14 months since Boston that there were decisions that could not be reached by thinking only by the body moving in one direction or another, and then the mind arriving afterward to understand what had been chosen. Her body walked to the main house at 7 in the morning. Callum was at the kitchen table with coffee, and the ranch ledger the same position he occupied every morning she had been here, adjusting the same columns of figures with the same focused patience. He looked up when she came in. She went to the stove. She poured coffee from the pot. She sat down across from him at the table. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at his ledger. Neither of them said anything about the previous evening. Neither of them said anything about Boston or Fletcher or the road that led back to Coldwater and the train station. She drank her coffee. He made a notation in his ledger. Outside the window, the snow on the barn roof caught the early light and held it. After a while, Nora came in and looked at them both with the expression of a woman who has long since stopped being surprised by the things she finds in her kitchen in the morning, and began making breakfast. That was how it was decided. Not with words, with a Tuesday morning in November. The days that followed had a different quality. Not better, not worse, different, in the way that weather differs from the forecast, which is to say that it had its own texture and its own logic that the prediction had not quite captured. She taught the 5 remaining students with the same method and the same standards she had always maintained, and she said nothing to any of them about the children who were absent, and she did not adjust the pace of the lessons for the smaller number, because to do so would have been to acknowledge that the absence was permanent. She did not yet know if it was permanent. Callum did not speak to her about the school or the students or Deke Harmon. What he did was appear twice in that first week in the doorway of the schoolhouse during lessons, not to observe exactly, but to deliver things. The first time it was a box of chalk he had ordered from Coldwater, which she had mentioned needing 3 weeks earlier, and had assumed he had not registered. The second time it was a book, a geography primer newer than anything currently on the shelf, still smelling of its binding, which he set on the desk without explanation, and then stood in the doorway a moment longer than was strictly necessary before leaving. One morning, a Thursday, she thought, though the days had begun to organize themselves differently. She arrived at the schoolhouse before the students and found Callum standing at the door, not knocking, just standing looking into the room through the small window set beside the frame. He did not see her coming. She stopped. He stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward the barn without trying the handle. She did not call after him. She went in and lit the stove and did not mention it at dinner, and neither did he. She did not thank him for the chalk or the primer in the moment. She thanked him at dinner on Friday specifically, and he said, "The children need materials," which was true and also not the only thing that was true. And they both understood the gap between those two territories. Martin Braddock read aloud on a Thursday, haltingly, syllable by syllable, his finger moving under each word with the concentration of someone dismantling something dangerous. But he read. When he finished the paragraph, he looked up at Alara with the expression of a person who has just accomplished something they were told was impossible and is not yet sure they are permitted to feel good about it. "Again," she said. The same word she had been saying for 3 weeks. But the way she said it was different, and he heard the difference, and he bent over the page again with something that looked remarkably like relief. After the students had gone, she sat at the front desk in the empty schoolhouse and thought about what teaching was, which was mostly invisibility, the teacher disappearing into the repetition, so that the students' progress could become visible. She thought about how she had loved that invisibility before Boston made it a liability. She thought, "I am not done with this." It was not a revelation. It was quieter than a revelation, more like a pressure equalizing. She had known it since she walked to the main house that morning, but knowing things and allowing yourself to know them are sometimes separated by an interval that varies in length depending on how frightening the knowledge is. It was Nora who told her. Not directly, nothing about Nora was direct precisely, but everything about her was honest. And Alara had come to understand that honesty and directness were not the same instrument. She found Alara in the cabin on a Saturday afternoon, which was unusual, because Nora did not make social calls. She came with a purpose for everything, and today's purpose was apparently to help move the dresser slightly further from the wall to allow for better airflow, which was practical and necessary, and also entirely pretextual. They moved the dresser. Then Nora sat in the chair by the window with the settled air of someone who has decided she is staying for a while. And Alara made tea, and they sat. 3 of the families came to the main house this week. Nora said. Elara held her cup. Not all three together, Nora said. Separately. Mrs. Kettridge on Wednesday, the Halloran woman Thursday, Mr. Price himself on Friday morning. She looked at the window. They wanted to talk about the school. And what did Mr. Reed tell them? Mr. Reed was out at the southern pasture all 3 times, Nora said. He talked to them when he came back in. Elara waited. Nora turned from the window. I talked to them before he did, she said. I have been here a long time, Miss Voss. I know these people. I know what they need to hear, and how they need to hear it, which is not the same as what is strictly true, but is not untrue either. She paused. I told them what I know about this ranch and the man who runs it. I told them what I have watched you do here for 2 months. I told them the children under your instruction have learned more in 8 weeks than in the 4 months preceding. She picked up her tea. The Kettridge girl comes back Monday. Elara looked at her. Possibly the Harmon boys, Nora said. That depends on Deke Harmon, which is a different matter. Why did you do that? Elara said, not accusingly. Because she genuinely wanted to know. Nora was quiet for a moment. She turned the cup in her hands, and in that gesture Elara saw something she had not seen in Nora before, which was uncertainty. Not about the action, she was certain about the action, but about how to explain it. I have managed this house for 7 years, Nora said. I have made it run. I have done it well. She paused. I have also made it harder than it should have been, for certain things to change. She stopped again. I was not kind to you when you arrived. I want you to understand that I know that. Elara said nothing. I kept this house exactly as it was, because I thought that was loyalty, Nora said. To her, to the way things were. She looked at the dresser they had moved. But loyalty to the dead is only useful if it serves the living, and I am old enough now to have been wrong about that for long enough that I should correct it. The room was quiet. Outside, one of the horses in the corral made a sound, a long, low exhalation. She was not happy, Elara said. No, Nora said. She wasn't. She did not sound defensive about this. She sounded tired, with the particular tiredness of someone who has carried something for a long time and has recently set it down. She was a good woman. She deserved more than she got from this place, and from him, though. I don't think he understood that. Until after, which is its own kind of tragedy. He understands now, Elara said. Nora looked at her. Something in that look was precise and complete, taking in everything, and returning nothing beyond recognition. Yes, she said. He does. She stood straightening with the slight deliberateness of someone whose joints have opinions. The Kettridge girl will be there Monday. Make sure the stove is warm when they arrive. The little ones don't settle when they're cold. She left. Elara sat alone in the rearranged room for a while. She thought about a woman who had decided that loyalty to the dead had to serve the living, or it was only sentiment. She thought that this was either wisdom or a thing that looked exactly like wisdom from the outside and required no distinction to be drawn. The table in the schoolhouse had a broken leg. Not broken entirely, The leg was cracked along its length, a fault in the wood that had probably been there since the building was converted, and it had been managed by wedging a piece of folded leather under one corner, which worked in principle but required that no one lean too heavily on that side of the surface or put anything heavy there. Ilara had been working around it since the first week, shifting materials to the opposite end, warning the older students without quite explaining why. She mentioned it to Callum in passing on a Wednesday, not as a request, but as an observation, in the same way she might mention that the sky looked like weather or that the morning had been cold. She did not think about it again. She arrived at the schoolhouse on Friday morning in the gray light before the students came with her lesson plans and a handful of pine branches she had gathered from the edge of the property because the room needed something that did not belong to work. She set the pine on the front desk. She turned to hang her coat. The table had been repaired. Not replaced, repaired properly. The cracked leg reinforced with a fitted brace of new wood. The leather wedge gone the surface level. The work was careful and exact, the kind that took more time than a quick fix, and had been thought about before being done. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. She had not asked. She had mentioned it once in passing at dinner. He had not said he would do it. He had simply done it at some point when the schoolhouse was empty and no one would see him doing it, and then said nothing. She turned and looked at the room, the 8 desks, the slightly angled blackboard. She had stopped noticing the shelf with its growing collection of books, the pine on the front desk, the repaired table with the new brace fitted exactly to the grain of the old wood. She thought, this is what it looks like when someone pays attention. Not the gesture, the table itself, the fit of the wood which required measuring and thinking, and then the work of making the thought real, the choosing to do it without announcement, which was a different kind of attention than the kind that needed to be witnessed. She stood there until she heard the first of the students coming up the path, and then she turned to the blackboard and picked up the chalk, and when they came in she said, "Good morning," and began. That evening she went to the main house porch. Callum was already there. He was usually there in the evenings when the weather allowed something she had come to understand was his way of decompressing at the end of the day, the same function served in other people by other rituals. He did not look up when she came up the steps, but he moved slightly, a small adjustment that made space without demanding it be filled. She sat. She looked at the dark beyond the yard and thought about how Fletcher had said, "Don't stay somewhere just because leaving feels harder than it used to." And she turned that over in her mind and examined it from the angle she had not examined it from before, which was this: leaving is not harder than it used to be. She had left Boston. She had left her profession and her city and the apartment on Camberton Street where she had lived for 6 years. Leaving was something she had recently demonstrated a capacity for. What was harder was something else. What was harder was staying for the right reason, which required knowing what the right reason was, which required a kind of clarity that had been largely unavailable to her for 14 months. She looked at the dark. She thought about Martin Braddock reading aloud. She thought about the Tennyson on the shelf with the dried ribbon. She thought about a cracked table leg measured and repaired. Callum said, "The Harmon boys came back today." She looked at him. All day. All day. He turned his coffee cup. Deke Harmon brought them himself. Stayed to talk to you, but You were in the middle of a lesson, so he left. A pause. He'll be back Monday, probably. She thought about Deke Harmon and what it meant that he was retreating, and whether it was a retreat that would hold or one that was simply waiting for better conditions. She thought, he's a practical man. He'll calculate what it costs him to keep fighting and decide it's not worth it. She thought that was probably true, and also a very limited kind of peace. But that limited kinds of peace were still peace. "Mr. Reed," she said. He turned to look at her. "I found a letter this morning. From Boston." She looked at him. "My brother wrote. The matter there has been resolved in my favor. The record has been corrected. I can return if I choose." He held her eyes. "Are you going to—" "No," she said. The words sat between them. She watched him absorb it. "Because of the school," he said. "Partly." He waited. "Because I came here not knowing what I was looking for," she said. "And I've found several things I wasn't expecting. And I think—" She stopped. She was not accustomed to speaking this way. She had a particular relationship with her own interior life, which was that she examined it carefully and extensively in private and exposed very little of it. This was not that. "I think leaving now would be a different kind of mistake than the one I thought I was making when I stayed." He was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the grass, and the horses shifted in the corral, and somewhere further out one of the cattle lowed once, and then was silent. "I was wrong about this place," he said. She waited. "I built it for her," he said. "Everything I've told you about the 15 years is true. But the reason I worked the way I worked from before light every day without stopping was because she told me once that she had always wanted a ranch, a real one. And I thought—" He stopped. "I thought if I built it large enough and solid enough, it would become what she needed it to be." He turned his cup once. "I was wrong. You can build a thing as large as 4,000 acres, and it can still be the wrong thing." Elara said nothing. She knew he was not finished. "She needed me to stop working long enough to look at her," he said. "I knew it, and I didn't know how to do it. And then she was gone, and the knowing became—" He stopped again, looked at the yard. "It became the thing I carry, that I knew, and didn't act on it." He turned to look at her. "I have been trying," he said, "to not make the same mistake twice. Which is more difficult than it sounds when the thing you're trying to do is also the thing you're worst at." She looked at him. The lamp from inside the house laid a line of light along the porch boards. She could see his face clearly enough. The weathered steadiness of it, the lines that were from squinting into the sun, and from other things, the eyes that were dark and direct, and carrying something that was no longer unnameable because she had been looking at it for 2 months and finally knew what it was. "You have been looking at me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been looking back." Another long silence. This one was different from the others. Not the silence of two people managing the space between them, but the silence of two people who have finished managing and are deciding what comes after. I don't know what I'm asking, he said. I know what I want to ask. I'm not sure I've earned the right to ask it yet. You repaired the table, she said. He looked at her. A moment passed. Then something shifted in his expression very slightly, the closest he came to being caught off guard. The table needed fixing, he said. I know, she said. That's why I said it. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him and did not look away, and the line of lamplight lay along the porch boards between them and the Wyoming winter sky above was the particular dark she had been looking at long enough to stop needing a name for. Miss Voss, he said. Elara, she said. He took that in, tried it silently. She could see it happening on his face, the word finding its place. Elara, he said. Yes, she said, which was an answer to a question that had not quite been asked, but which they both understood in the particular way that two people understand things that do not need to be made fully explicit. He did not move across the porch. She did not move toward him. They sat in the cold in the dark and looked at the land they were both beginning to understand as shared. And after a while she went back to the cabin, and he remained on the porch. And nothing had been resolved in the conventional sense, and everything had been said in the most important one. The letter from Fletcher arrived in the first week of December. She had been expecting it. He had said he would write when he was back in Boston, and Fletcher's word was one of the few things in her life she had consistently been able to rely on. It came on a Thursday, and she read it at the schoolhouse desk after the students had gone in the thin, late afternoon light that was all the sun provided now that December had arrived. He had spoken to Reverend Abernathy. He had spoken to 3 of the Whitmore school parents. The new record was on file with the school board official, documented, corrected. The word is there, Ellie, if you want. What happened to Daniel Whitmore was not your fault. The board should have said so at the time. They are saying so now for whatever it is worth. She read it twice. She sat with it for a while. What she felt was not what she had expected to feel. For 14 months, she had carried the shape of this vindication in the back of her mind, the possibility of it, and had told herself it would matter enormously if it came. But sitting with it now, she found that it was lighter than she had imagined, that the weight of Boston had been redistributing itself for some time, without her registering each shift, that the morning she had walked to the main house in the snow had changed the load-bearing structure of things in ways she was still mapping. She was glad. The record mattered. The truth on file, official and documented, mattered. She was glad for it. She folded the letter and placed it in the copybook she kept in the desk drawer. She looked at the classroom, at the 8 desks, at the slightly angled blackboard she had accepted as part of the room's particular character, at the repaired table with its precise new brace. She picked up her coat and her lesson plans and walked out into the early December afternoon. Callum was in the corral when she came around the side of the barn. He was working with the youngest of the horses, a gray quarter horse that was still learning what it meant to be ridden, and he had his full attention on the animal. In the way he gave things his full attention quietly, without performance, reading and responding in increments small enough that the horse had time to understand each one before the next. She stopped at the fence and watched. He had not seen her yet. He was moving with the horse in a wide circle, letting the animal set the pace, one hand on the lead and the other at his side. He spoke occasionally too low for her to hear. The horse moved, stopped, moved again, each repetition slightly more settled than the last. She thought about how she had looked at him that first day on the platform, calculating, competent, careful, and how she had thought in the flat way of a woman conducting an assessment. This man will not require anything. I am not prepared to give. She thought about how spectacularly wrong that had been. Not because he was demanding, but because she had not known yet what she was prepared to give, and had learned it here in Wyoming in the specific company of this specific person, over 3 months of meals and silences and small revelations. He turned, saw her at the fence. He brought the horse around and tied the lead to the post and came to the fence. "He's coming along," she said. "Slowly," he said. "He doesn't trust fast." "Some don't," she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He had learned in the past weeks that she looked at him the same way, regardless of whether he was looking at her or not, which had taken him a while to adjust to, and which he had adjusted to without comment. "Letter came," he said. "Not a question." "Yes." "Good news." "Yes," she said. "The record has been corrected in Boston. Officially." He waited. "Daniel Whitmore was a student in my class in the spring of 1888, she said. "He was 14. He was struggling with the transition from the lower school academically, and in other ways I was only beginning to understand." She looked at the fence post, at the grain of the wood. "In March of that year, he was found in the schoolroom after hours. He had hurt himself. He recovered." She paused. "The school board convened. They determined that my failure to communicate his difficulties to his parents in a timely fashion had contributed to the situation. They dismissed me." The corral was quiet. The gray horse moved slowly at the end of the lead. "And the truth of it," he said, "the truth of it is that I had communicated his difficulties," she said, "in writing, to the headmaster, twice requesting that the parents be contacted. The headmaster did not act on either communication." She stopped. "He was a popular man. The Whitmore family was a prominent one. I was a teacher. The calculation was not complex." "No," Callum said. "It wouldn't have been. The record now says that," she said, "that my communications were filed, that the failure was not mine, that the school board's determination was incorrect." She looked at him. "That's what the letter says." He held her eyes. He said, "I'm glad." Not, "I told you so." Not, "I knew it." Not, "You should have told me sooner." Just, "I'm glad." 2 words carrying the weight of everything she had been waiting without knowing she was waiting to be told. She nodded. "I should have told you months ago," she said. "I want you to know I understand that." "You told me when you could," he said. "That's generous." "It's accurate," he said. She almost smiled. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Make a distinction between those 2 things when other people wouldn't bother." He considered this in the way he considered things, taking it seriously without making a production of it. "I spent a long time being inaccurate about things that mattered," he said. "I find I prefer not to." She looked at him. The afternoon light was going the sky in the west, turning the complicated colors. It turned in winter nothing as dramatic as the sunsets she had read about before coming west, but quietly extraordinary in the way that things which happened every day could be, if you were in the habit of looking. "I'm not going back to Boston," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to be clear that I'm not staying because the alternative closed. The alternative is open. The record is corrected. I could return to teaching in Boston." She held his eyes. "I am staying because I want to stay. I want you to know the distinction." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face changed, not dramatically, not in the way that people describe change when they mean transformation. A smaller change, the kind that comes when something that has been held in tension is finally released when a thing long braced for either arrives or does not, and you can finally stop bracing. "Elara," he said. "Yes," she said. He came around the fence. He stopped in front of her, and they stood close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes clearly. The sun lines and the other kind. The kind that came from thinking, from working, from 7 years of looking at a land that did not look back. He raised one hand and held it just at the edge of her space, the same way he did everything, giving time, not taking. She put her hand in his. His hand was warm and rough and larger than her own, and she felt the deliberateness of it, the care, the same quality that had reinforced a cracked table leg, with exactly the right amount of wood and exactly the right fit, nothing more and nothing less than what was needed. They stood there in the December afternoon at the fence of the corral, in the long, low light of a Wyoming winter. The spring came the way Wyoming springs come, not gently, not apologetically, but as a fact. Overnight, the snow retreating to the higher ground, and the grass beginning its return with the color of something long held, finally released. On a morning in April, Elara received a second letter from Fletcher. She read it at the kitchen table of the main house over coffee, while Callum reviewed his ledger across from her. This was their ordinary morning now. His ledger and her letters and the coffee that was always ready because one of them was always up before the other and had made it. The letter was short. Fletcher had met a woman in December, a school teacher herself, a widow with a young daughter, and the situation had developed over the winter with the characteristic Fletcher speed that was the opposite of Elara's own nature, and had always worked for him anyway. He was happy. He wanted Elara to know he was happy. He wanted to know in his indirect way that she was too. She put the letter down. "Good news," Callum said, without looking up from his ledger. "Fletcher is getting married," she said. He looked up. "Is that good news?" "Very," she said. "He's been alone long enough." Something moved in Callum's expression that was not quite a smile, but was what a smile came from. "I'll write to him today," she said. She looked at the window at the yard where the mud was beginning to dry at the edges, and the horses in the corral were moving with the particular energy of animals who have endured a long winter and can feel the change. "I'll tell him things are well here." "Are they?" he said. She looked at him across the table at the man who had given her a room that was half emptied, and a table that needed fixing, and a question asked every morning in the form of a ledger page turned toward where she could see it. "Yes," she said. "I think they are." He nodded once and looked back at his ledger. and she picked up her cup and looked at the yard and the horses in the spring pale sky above the mountains that she was still even now learning how to see. Outside in the schoolhouse east of the barn, 8 desks waited. The blackboard hung at its slight angle. The repaired table stood level, the new brace fitted to the grain of the old wood, neither visible nor invisible, simply there doing what it was built to do, holding things steady under the weight of whatever came next.